Hey there. Tonight, we're going somewhere deeper than most history books are willing to go. Into the shadows behind the Vatican's most whispered betrayal. You've probably heard of the Templars, those white-cloaked knights of legend. But what you might not know is that their greatest enemy may not have worn armor at all, but robes. This story isn't just about swords and faith, it's about silence, about sealed scrolls, missing maps, and the quiet hands that moved pieces on a board most of us were never meant to see. If you enjoy drifting through these darker corridors of history with me, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And if you're comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how these stories gently echo across time zones, like candlelight passed hand to hand. Now ease into the quiet, and let's begin unraveling what was never meant to be remembered. Deep beneath the polished marble of Vatican City, far from the footfall of tourists and the hum of whispered prayer, there are corridors few ever walk. Some lead to locked libraries, others to chambers that do not appear on any official floor plan. One such room, known only by a code etched faintly into a worn brass plate, is sealed by a vault door older than most of the basilica's foundations. According to a 19th century Jesuit inventory now classified, the room contains nothing but a dust-covered oak box and a single scroll stamped with two red seals. One is unmistakable, the red cross of the Knights Templar. The other, more stylized, is a crescent blade, commonly attributed to the Nizari Ismailis of Persia, whom medieval chroniclers referred to as the Assassins. Historians have long dismissed any possibility of cooperation between these two forces, insisting they were enemies born of rival faiths. But what if that is not true? What if those seals are not the sign of conflict, but of something deeper, an accord, forged not in blood but in silence? And more disturbing still, why would the Vatican preserve such a document for over 700 years, yet never mention it? In the records of papal bulls and crusading decrees, there is no entry for a pact between the Church's most powerful military order and its sworn Eastern heretics. Yet the scroll exists. Its age is consistent with parchment from the late 12th century. The wax used matches that found on other Templar legal documents. And while its contents remain sealed, the Vatican's decision to hide it rather than destroy it suggests something even more dangerous than heresy: proof. Tonight, we begin where most histories end. Not with the rise of the Templars or their battlefield victories, but with a whisper beneath the stones of Rome. A question that has lingered since the firelight flickered beneath the Pont Neuf Bridge in 1314. Did the Vatican not only condemn the Templars, but betray them? The silence of centuries has protected many secrets, but some, no matter how deeply buried, begin to hum when the world grows quiet enough to listen. The story of the Knights Templar does not begin in secrecy, but in solemnity. In the year 1119, 2 decades after the First Crusade recaptured Jerusalem, a small band of knights led by Hugues de Payan approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a request. They sought no land, no titles, only a place to live within the city walls so they might carry out a singular mission: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling the treacherous roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Baldwin granted them quarters within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which stood atop the ancient foundations of the Temple of Solomon. It was from this sacred and politically loaded location that they would take their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. To outsiders, they appeared austere and pious, knights who took monastic vows, wore simple white robes, and claimed to own nothing. But within a few short decades, they would evolve into one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. As the Crusades dragged on, wealthy nobles and monarchs began donating land and treasure to the order in exchange for spiritual favor or military support. The Templars soon held estates across Europe, collected tithes, managed wealth for monarchs, and developed a network of fortified strongholds that stretched from Scotland to the Levant. By the middle of the 13th century, they had become Europe's most formidable transnational power. Yet with influence came suspicion. Their rituals were closed to outsiders. Their loyalties, officially pledged to the papacy, often ran parallel to royal agendas. And most crucially, they had built something no kingdom had ever dared: a secure financial network that operated independently of both church and crown. The Templars were not just knights anymore. They had become bankers, treasurers, and gatekeepers of secrets. Their order existed in a space neither fully religious nor purely military. This duality, blessed by the Pope but feared by kings, would one day become their undoing. For while they claimed to fight for Christendom, they were beginning to act like something else entirely, a sovereign force with the power to choose who lived, who ruled, and perhaps who remembered. Far from the stone halls of Europe, in the high mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria, another order was taking shape. One that shared no allegiance to pope or king, yet operated with equal precision and fear. Known to the West only through the terrified accounts of crusaders and travelers, the Nizari Ismailis emerged in the late 11th century under the leadership of a man named Hassan-i-Sabah. In 1090, he seized the remote fortress of Alamut, perched high in the Alborz mountains of Persia, and declared it the center of a new movement. His followers, later dubbed assassins by European chroniclers, were not a monastic order, but a revolutionary one. They did not wage war on the battlefield. They studied language, science, theology, and most importantly, the art of targeted elimination. Their method was simple and terrifying. Strike only the head, never the body. Kill the vizier, not the army. Remove the bishop, not the church. It is from them that Europe inherited the very concept of a political killing carried out with precision, message, and symbolism. They were not soldiers. They were ideas made flesh, and like the Templars, they too existed outside the structure of conventional power. While Sunni rulers branded them heretics and Christian armies labeled them demons, they survived for generations. Their secret lay in loyalty, not to empire, but to vision. Just as the Templars were answering to something higher than any crown, the assassins were answering to something older than any caliph. These two forces, the templated power of the West and the silent blade of the East, were not supposed to meet, and yet they did. Not often, not loudly. But across the blood-stained sands of the Crusades, there are patterns that resist the official record. Missing battles, unexplained truces, fortresses built within walking distance of one another, and most disturbingly, a strange absence of war between them. In an era where ideology demanded annihilation, the Templars and the Assassins seem to have found, at least briefly, something else. A mutual pause, a silence where there should have been screams. And it is in this silence, some believe, that the Vatican began to watch, and perhaps intervene. By the middle of the 12th century, the Holy Land had become a chessboard of shifting alliances, fortified outposts, and foreign ambitions. The Templars, now a sanctioned military order with papal privileges, were expanding their influence far beyond their original mission. Their commanderies dotted the landscape from the ports of Acre to the hilltop fortress of Safed. At the same time, the assassins operated from strongholds in Syria and Persia, most notably from the fortress of Masyaf near Hama. Despite the volatile landscape and the constant conflicts among Muslim, Byzantine, and Crusader factions, these two orders, the Christian Knights and the Ismaili Killers, rarely clashed. In fact, some chronicles record moments of startling cooperation. According to the 13th century chronicler William of Tyre, a Templar knight once visited Masyaf under a flag of truce, though the reason was never disclosed. In 1173, European sources noted a sudden cessation of assassin attacks on Crusader figures, coinciding with a quiet diplomatic exchange whose records are now lost. Was this a coincidence, or was something being negotiated behind the veils of war? Even more curious is the geographical proximity of their operations. At least 4 Templar strongholds were within a 3-day ride of known assassin centers. 1. The castle of Chastelblanc near Safita stood only 2 mountain passes away from a suspected assassin outpost. In a time when heresy was punishable by fire and alliances were dictated by faith, The lack of open hostility between the two should have been cause for suspicion, and yet no papal condemnation ever addressed it. No royal inquiry pursued it. Instead, both orders continued their operations largely undisturbed, so long as they did not directly interfere with Vatican interests. This pattern suggests more than tolerance. It suggests orchestration. For the Vatican, which claimed to be the guardian of Christian unity, the silence between the sword and the dagger may have served a higher purpose: control. As long as the two orders balanced each other and remained useful, they could be permitted to exist, even to share knowledge and resources, so long as the Holy See remained the unseen hand between them. It is this absence of intervention, this selective blindness, that marks the beginning of what some now believe was the Vatican's greatest manipulation of the medieval age. In 1191, a strange event was recorded outside the ancient city of Acre. Following the brutal capture of the city during the Third Crusade, a lull fell over the region, a quiet not of peace, but of recalibration. Around this time, Arab sources refer obliquely to a Frankish emissary who was granted safe passage to Masyaf. No name was given, no title recorded, only that he wore white and bore no sword. Western records from the same period mention a diplomatic absence by a Templar commander whose whereabouts remain unexplained. These fragments, when placed side by side, paint the outline of something never officially acknowledged, a covert meeting between two orders who were, by doctrine, meant to destroy each other. Later that year, a known enemy of both factions, a Turkish emir notorious for raiding Christian pilgrims and persecuting Ismaili communities, was assassinated in his bathhouse. No one claimed responsibility, but within days, his garrison surrendered to a combined force of crusaders and local militias without a fight. Official histories make no connection, but the timing suggests coordination. One silent strike, one political shift, and an entire region destabilized. These alignments became more frequent as the 13th century approached. Strategic deaths, sudden withdrawals, changes in territorial control that benefited both the Templars and the Assassins. Yet the Vatican never issued a formal statement. No investigations, no trials. It was as if these events took place in a separate reality, one ungoverned by papal law, or perhaps one governed by papal interest. In 1226, Pope Honorius III issued a decree forbidding the copying or storage of any document bearing both Templar and Assassin insignias. No reason was given, no context provided. The order was not widely distributed and was quietly archived years later, never officially revoked. What could justify such a specific and secretive act? Only one answer presents itself. There were documents, and those documents revealed a truth the Vatican could not allow to circulate. A truth not of doctrine or dogma, but of collusion. In the eyes of history, silence often looks like ignorance. But in this case, it may have been something far more deliberate, the sound of a secret being kept. By the mid-13th century, the relationship between the Templars and the Vatican had grown strained, though not openly adversarial. The Templars still received papal privileges, tax exemptions, legal autonomy, and the right to operate independently of local bishops. But they had evolved into something more than a military order. They were financiers, landowners, and political brokers. Their treasury in Paris was more secure than the royal mint. Kings borrowed from them. Nobles deposited wealth with them. In effect, they became the first true international bank in Western Europe. Meanwhile, their fortresses in the Levant were becoming more than mere outposts. They served as repositories for documents, relics, and items of strategic intelligence, including maps, letters, and possibly even intercepted communications from rival factions. At the same time, the assassins, though diminished after internal schisms and external pressures, continued to operate through a network of hidden outposts, some of which remained untouched even as larger powers collapsed. There are scattered records in Eastern sources describing Frange men visiting assassin-held towns under the cover of night. These men were said to bring scrolls and receive no hospitality, only direction. Western scholars long interpreted these tales as fable, but when cross-referenced with abrupt changes in Crusader military routes, unexplained shifts in siege tactics, and sudden changes in fortress design, the possibility of a quiet exchange emerges. Not friendship, not alliance, mutual advantage. And all of it the Vatican knew. Some of it was even facilitated by clergy. In 1247, a document now held in a restricted section of the Vatican Library details a papal envoy's journey through Templar territory with a sealed case. His path took him through 2 assassin-controlled villages in northern Syria. He reported no delays, no interference. That same year, 3 anti-papal bishops in Europe were assassinated in quick succession, each under mysterious circumstances. Their deaths benefited both Templar expansion and papal policy. No connection was ever drawn in public, but privately something shifted. Over the next decade, the Vatican quietly restructured its intelligence networks, reassigned numerous clerics, and began an internal inquiry that left no formal records. The silence thickened. It no longer hid mere activity. It now concealed purpose. In the year 1258, the Mongol Empire delivered a catastrophe to the Islamic world that reverberated across both Christian and Muslim territories. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led the siege of Baghdad, resulting in the complete destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city, once the intellectual and cultural heart of Islam, was burned, and its libraries thrown into the Tigris River. The death toll remains uncertain, but is believed to have been in the hundreds of thousands. Among those who took notice of this devastation were not only the Muslim rulers of the region but also the Latin Church and the Crusader states. With the Mongols now approaching Syria and threatening the last Crusader footholds, a remarkable and largely undocumented shift occurred. According to Persian and Arabic sources, certain outposts belonging to the Nizari Ismailis were quietly abandoned. Their forces, though few in number, were observed moving eastward into areas soon to be overrun by Mongol armies. Meanwhile, a handful of Templar commanders in Tortosa and Acre began rerouting supplies and manpower away from the coastal defense lines, focusing instead on inland routes, ones that would allow quick withdrawal rather than resistance. No battle records exist of the Templars or assassins fighting directly against the Mongols, but eyewitness accounts suggest something more ambiguous: coordination. A handful of Genoese sailors later testified under interrogation that they had seen Frankish knights and Muslim fighters traveling together in eastern Syria during the siege years, bearing no banners, wearing no identifiable insignias. One described them as ghosts of the cross and the crescent, walking the same road without speaking. If these reports are true, then the common enemy of the Mongols did something no prior conflict had managed. It forced the Templars and the assassins into silent alignment, not alliance, not trust, just necessity. A Latin manuscript recovered in 1894 from a monastic archive in Corsica bears a single chilling sentence written in faded ink. When the wind comes from the north, the blade and the cross must turn to face it together. It bears no author, no date, no signature. Yet its timing suggests it was written not by a philosopher but by a witness, and perhaps the Vatican was that witness, standing not in fear but in calculation. As the Mongol threat receded in the late 1260s, pulled back by succession crises and internal conflict, the Levant returned to its fragile equilibrium. Fractured city-states, uneasy truces, and religious factions jockeying for influence. But something fundamental had changed. During those violent years, the Vatican had maintained an eerie silence. No crusade was called in defense of Baghdad. No papal envoys were dispatched to aid the Christian kingdoms of the East. Instead, Rome observed, and when the Mongols withdrew, the Holy See moved quickly to reassert control. A series of clerical appointments reshaped the hierarchy in Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Bishops with known sympathies toward the Templars were quietly replaced. Inquisitors began circulating through southern France and northern Italy, not to confront heretics, but to compile lists of Templar landholdings and revenue channels. At first, it seemed like a reorganization, but the patterns tell a different story. The Church was not simply managing its military orders, it was preparing for something. Meanwhile, the assassins, reeling from the fall of their Persian centers to Mongol forces, began consolidating their presence in Syria. According to Mamluk-era chronicles, the remnants of the Nizari leadership retreated into small, autonomous cells, communicating only through pre-arranged couriers and using ciphered scripts. One of these scripts, intercepted by a Franciscan brother in Aleppo and delivered to Rome, reportedly described an unnamed Northern order with whom a shared purpose had once been drawn in sand and sealed with silence. That parchment disappeared from the Vatican record within 2 years of its arrival. But its content, as quoted in the brother's journal, hints at a level of collaboration that no official doctrine could sanction. This growing tension between public condemnation and private complicity forced the Vatican into a dangerous position. The Templars had become too rich, too autonomous, and too globally entangled. The assassins, though diminished, still possessed a knowledge network that extended from the ports of Acre to the markets of Cairo. Together, they represented something no central power could tolerate for long, a partnership beyond the control of church or empire. And so the Vatican, ever the patient architect, began laying the groundwork, not for judgment, but for betrayal. The first visible crack appeared not in the East, but in the heart of Europe. By the dawn of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France found himself drowning in debt. His wars against England and Flanders had depleted the treasury, and his court was notorious for its extravagance. His most significant creditor? The Knights Templar. Their Paris commandery served as a de facto central bank, storing not only the king's funds, but also those of nobles, abbots, and merchants. Philip had already attempted to tax the French clergy, an act that earned him excommunication and humiliation. He had tried to seize coin from the Lombards and the Jews, but the Templars, with their vast wealth and papal protection, remained out of reach. Then something changed. On October 13, 1307, acting under sealed orders, Philip's men arrested every Templar in France. Accusations ranged from heresy and idol worship to blasphemous initiation rites. The charges were sensational, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and venerating a mysterious head said to possess divine knowledge. Torture extracted confessions, property was seized, public trust was shattered. But what many forget is that Philip could not have moved without the Vatican. Pope Clement V, a Frenchman and Philip's political subordinate in many respects, initially protested. He called for the Templars to be tried under church law, not royal decree, but within months his tone shifted. Whether through pressure, persuasion, or blackmail, Clement issued the Bull Pastoralis Preeminenti in November 1307, instructing Christian monarchs across Europe to arrest Templars and confiscate their holdings. It was the first act of coordinated suppression in church history aimed at its own military arm. The reasons remain debated. Some historians claim Clement believed the charges. Others point to Philip's control over the papacy, which had been relocated to Avignon in 1309. But the timing is unmistakable. Just as the Templars had reached their peak, spanning east and west, managing secret knowledge networks, and navigating global finance. They were eliminated not by their enemies, but by the throne they once served, and the church that had once blessed them. The betrayal was not loud, it was legislative, papal, surgical. The trials that followed were not trials in any meaningful sense. They were performances, rituals of humiliation carried out in dungeons, cloisters, and candlelit chambers, all beneath the gaze of ecclesiastical scribes and royal enforcers. In Paris, in Poitiers, and later in London, Templars were paraded as cautionary examples of pride, secrecy, and heresy. But beneath the surface of these public confessions lay contradictions that Vatican officials worked carefully to suppress. In many cases, the accused recanted under oath once the instruments of torture were removed. Multiple bishops expressed skepticism about the charges. The Archbishop of Sens even refused to participate in the hearings, citing procedural violations and theological absurdity. Nonetheless, the machinery rolled on. In 1312, under heavy pressure from Philip IV, Pope Clement V convened the Council of Vienne. There, without presenting concrete evidence or granting the accused a platform to speak in their own defense, he issued the bull Vox in Excelso, which dissolved the Templar order not as a declaration of guilt, but as a measure for the sake of peace and unity. This language was not an admission, it was a legal maneuver. The Vatican could not risk acknowledging its own role in empowering an order that had grown so autonomous. Nor could it allow further investigations into the Templars' holdings, contacts, or secretive alliances across the eastern Mediterranean. What the Pope needed was silence. What Philip needed was confiscation. And so they struck a compromise. The Templar properties were to be transferred to the Hospitallers, another military order more closely aligned with the Vatican. But in practice, many of the most valuable assets ended up in royal hands. The Church received plausible deniability, the king received wealth, and the Templars received fire. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned at the stake on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. As the flames rose, he reportedly turned toward Notre Dame and proclaimed that both the Pope and the King would soon answer for their crimes before God. Within a year, Clement V and Philip IV were dead, their records sealed, their motives buried, but the betrayal, unwritten and unfinished, remained etched in stone and ash. In the years that followed the suppression of the Templars, the Vatican undertook a quiet but deliberate campaign to control the narrative. Official documents were archived under restrictive access. Witness accounts that contradicted the heresy charges were discredited or disappeared altogether. Monastic scribes who had once chronicled the Templars' campaigns in the Holy Land were reassigned to other duties or instructed to omit their names from future entries. But the more the Church tried to seal the past, the more fragments began to resurface. Scattered records in obscure abbeys, untranslated codices in mountain libraries, and strange reports from surviving Templar associates who had either fled into exile or vanished entirely. One such fragment was discovered in 1754 in a sealed drawer at the Abbey of Montserrat in Catalonia. It was a single page written in Latin, apparently torn from a larger scroll, bearing two wax seals, one of the familiar red cross, and one resembling a crescented blade. The text referred cryptically to a meeting in the year 1171, in the shadows east of Palmyra, where two emissaries, one of the cross and one of the blade, laid down their iron and drew a single map upon the sand. The rest of the passage had faded, but the implication was clear. There had been contact, perhaps even collaboration, between the Templars and the assassins long before the Vatican had reason to suppress it. Whether the Church knew of this contact in the 12th century is unknown, but the decree issued by Pope Honorius III in 1226, prohibiting the storage or copying of documents bearing both insignias, suggests that by then someone in Rome was aware, and not only aware, but alarmed. Why alarmed? Because such a connection undermined the core justification of the Church's authority, moral separation from heresy. If two of history's most infamous orders, one militant and Catholic, the other secretive and Islamic, had exchanged not just blows, but knowledge, then what else had they shared? Territory, intelligence, coin? The Vatican's silence grew not out of ignorance, but necessity. If the world were to learn that the Templars' downfall had less to do with heresy and more to do with political convenience, then the question would arise: who truly controlled the fall, and who wrote the story after the bodies turned to dust? Among the more enigmatic discoveries connected to this web of vanished memory is a document known as the Testamentum Deluxe, a scorched manuscript partially recovered from beneath the ruins of the old Templar stronghold in Paris during early 20th century excavations. Though its provenance remains debated, the text bears the unmistakable seal of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. The surviving pages speak not of revenge or redemption, but of betrayal, not by a rival order or foreign enemy, but by those closest to the altar. One line stands out with particular force: "The Church that anointed us now extinguishes us, not for our sins, but for knowing what it must forget." The document mentions by name several cardinals who, according to the text, were present during secret meetings in Acre, meetings that included not only Templar leadership, but also unnamed visitors from the East. The suggestion is that the Vatican was not merely aware of the Templars' dealings with other powers, it may have helped facilitate them. The purpose of these exchanges remains speculative, but the wording implies a shared concern for the movement of relics, trade routes, and information, particularly in the years when Mongol incursions threatened to erase Christian and Muslim strongholds alike. If the assassins and the Templars found ways to exchange maps, intelligence, or even safe passage through contested lands, then they were not acting in defiance of Rome. They were acting with its blessing, or at least its reluctant acquiescence. What changed, then? Why did the Vatican turn on the Templars if they had once been useful partners in a grander strategic game? The answer may lie in timing. By the late 13th century, the Templars had outgrown their role as soldiers of the cross. They were financiers, guardians of secrets, and perhaps worst of all, no longer dependent on papal authority. The Vatican had created an institution it could no longer control. And in a church obsessed with hierarchy and obedience, that was intolerable. The assassins, already weakened by Mongol invasions and internal division, posed less of a threat, but the Templars, wealthy, networked, and autonomous, were now dangerous not because of what they did, but because of what they knew. While much of the modern focus on the Templar suppression remains fixed on France, the tremors of their downfall were felt far beyond Paris. In Italy, Spain, Portugal, and even distant Hungary, Templar houses were raided, inventories seized, and brothers imprisoned. Yet in many cases, the evidence presented against them was inconsistent, vague, or entirely absent. Local clergy often resisted the orders, citing the Templars' long-standing service and spotless reputations. In Aragon, King James II expressed skepticism, demanding that charges be substantiated before surrendering his Templar subjects. In Portugal, King Denis went a step further. Rather than disband the order entirely, he rebranded it as the Order of Christ in 1319, allowing many former Templars to continue operating under a new name and charter. The Vatican granted this request. This quiet restructuring reveals a deeper contradiction. The Church was not concerned with theological purity alone. It sought to extinguish a specific concentration of knowledge, wealth, and independence, not necessarily to destroy every knight who had ever taken the oath. The question then becomes, what exactly did the Central Templar Command know that made them dangerous to the papacy? Several scholars have pointed to their unique access to Eastern knowledge systems, navigation techniques, medicinal practices, astronomical charts that filtered into Europe through Templar networks. Others argue that the Templars preserved forbidden texts recovered from libraries in Constantinople or Damascus during earlier crusading campaigns. More speculative theories suggest they held heretical gospels, ancient genealogies, or even information that challenged church doctrine. These claims often veer into myth, but they share one common element: secrecy. And secrecy is what made the Vatican most uneasy. An institution built on universal truth cannot afford rival custodians of hidden knowledge. This is why the suppression of the Templars was so absolute. Not just arrests and executions, but the destruction of their archives, the dispersal of their properties, and the erasure of their role in shaping the late medieval world. The betrayal was not personal. It was systemic. The moment the Templars ceased being instruments of the Church and began acting as curators of power in their own right, their fate was sealed. The blade that fell upon them bore the mark of the very hand that once crowned their shields. In 1941, during the height of the Second World War, the Vatican undertook a quiet internal operation to relocate certain documents from its central archives in response to fears of German occupation. While many of these texts were standard theological volumes and diplomatic correspondences, a few were marked with a cryptic sigil unfamiliar to most archivists, a small triangle composed of 3 dots inverted. This symbol, according to surviving internal memos now held in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, designated materials deemed not merely sensitive but historically volatile. Among the relocated documents was a 14th century manuscript bearing no author, title, or known origin. It was written in Latin, though its structure suggested influence from Persian poetic forms. Within its pages was a series of short reflections, each describing a moment when silence altered the course of history. One passage stood out to the archivists who examined it, a detailed account of a meeting in Cyprus in the year 1212. The text described 3 emissaries, one from Rome, one bearing the seal of the temple, and one from an unnamed Eastern sect, who convened in a disused chapel outside Limassol. No minutes were kept, no agreements signed, but the text makes a bold claim. That night no treaty was written, but an understanding was reached. One that would shape the next 50 years and must never be spoken again. The document was sealed again, stored beneath a false ledger entry, and effectively disappeared. But the question lingers. Why would the Church preserve a record of such a meeting if it posed a threat to its official narrative? The answer lies not in denial, but in control. To destroy a document is to make it a myth. To preserve it in silence is to domesticate its danger. This approach has defined the Vatican's treatment of anything that challenges its primacy. It does not refute, it absorbs. And it ensures that if the past ever rises to speak, it will do so only in a voice the Church has already measured. The betrayal of the Templars was never total erasure. It was careful erasure, leaving behind just enough residue to remind those watching closely that some silences are not mistakes. They are strategies. In the quiet corners of Switzerland, Armenia, and southern Italy, fragments of memory escaped the Vatican's reach, not through rebellion but through forgetfulness. Monasteries perched in remote valleys, often overlooked during papal purges, became unintentional time capsules. In the late 19th century, a Jesuit scholar named Father Antonius Reiner catalogued such fragments while traveling through the Maronite communities of Mount Lebanon. Among the manuscripts he recorded was an untitled codex preserved in the cellar of a crumbling stone chapel. It bore no official stamp, but included handwritten marginal notes in both Latin and Syriac, referencing an entity called Umbra Trium, the Shadow of Three. The codex mentioned no names, no locations, but described a network of couriers who carried sealed scrolls between a holy fortress in the west, a mountain citadel in the east, and a third, unnamed source marked only by a key. These scrolls were never to be opened by the messengers themselves. Their job was not to know, but to deliver. What stunned Reiner was not the content of the codex, but the language used, terms lifted from canonical papal decrees, yet twisted into patterns more consistent with cryptographic cipher than liturgical prose. He submitted a report to the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1897. The manuscript was seized within 6 months. Reiner's access to archives was quietly revoked. His future writings never again mentioned Umbra Trium. But in a private letter to a colleague in Munich, Reiner wrote, "The Church claims to fear heresy, but it fears unregulated memory more. For heresy can be excommunicated. Memory, once shared, can never be undone." His words, too, would vanish from public circulation. It became increasingly clear that the Vatican's role in the Templars' undoing was not merely reactive, it was preventive. The Church did not fear the Templars for their military strength or their rituals, but because they had developed their own chain of communication, one that circumvented the pulpit, the crown, and even Scripture. And perhaps most unsettling, they were not alone in doing so. The assassins, though vastly different in origin, shared the same ethos, loyalty not to authority, but to message. In a world governed by doctrine, this was a threat no dogma could contain. In the wake of these twin collapses, a peculiar phenomenon unfolded, one that history rarely acknowledges because it left so few traces. Individuals who had once served as intermediaries between the Templars and the assassins, often cloaked in the anonymity of their roles, began to vanish from records entirely. These were not grand masters or legendary figures. They were scribes, translators, navigators, and monks. People who moved silently between commanderies and mountain fortresses, never attracting attention, never bearing titles. In monastic records from the 14th century, we begin to see signs of their quiet disappearance. Names struck from ledgers, abbeys reassigning their chroniclers with no explanation. Small shrines suddenly shuttered or abandoned. One such entry from a Benedictine monastery near Marseille records the sudden reassignment of Brother Aldrich, who had overseen foreign manuscript translations for over a decade. His last noted task was the handling of scrolls bearing unfamiliar seals to be prepared for review by the Curia. He was never heard from again. In another case, a Franciscan envoy stationed in the Latin quarter of Constantinople wrote of meeting a man who spoke flawless Persian and Latin and wore no ecclesiastical insignia, only a ring carved with 3 interlocking symbols, a key, a cross, and a curved blade. When asked his name, the man replied only, "I am what remains between things that no longer speak." That letter was intercepted, redacted, and stored in the Vatican archives, where it surfaced briefly in the 1970s before vanishing once more. These figures, the silent couriers, the translators without affiliations, represented a type of power the Vatican could neither absorb nor excommunicate. They were living remnants of a network that had once spanned continents, faiths, and ideologies, and in a world governed by hierarchy, their very existence posed a problem. The betrayal of the Templars and the dismantling of the assassins was not complete until these links were severed. But that severance did not always come by sword or fire. It came through the quiet redirection of lives, the removal of names from history, and the silent instruction, disappear. And most of them did, leaving only shadows and fragments, proof that what was once known could be forgotten, not by accident, but by design. In 1312, the official dissolution of the Templars was proclaimed by Pope Clement V, but the decree was carefully worded. It stated that the order was not condemned for proven guilt, but for the scandal it had caused and the danger of public unrest. In this phrasing lay the Vatican's final maneuver, an end without confession. By refusing to declare the Templars heretical, the Church avoided directly implicating itself for having once endorsed them so fully. And yet it ensured that the order would never rise again. Their properties were to be handed to the Hospitallers, though in many regions kings quietly absorbed the most lucrative assets. Their members were scattered, some imprisoned, others released into obscurity, and a few protected under new identities by sympathetic nobles or foreign courts. But the question remained, what became of the knowledge the Templars had accumulated during their century of operation? From their dealings in the Levant to their encrypted correspondence and rumored possession of non-canonical texts, the order had long been suspected of holding more than gold, and this, many scholars now believe, was the real concern in Rome. In a letter written in 1313 by Cardinal Bertrand de Got, the Pope's cousin, he expresses unease about fragments of truth scattered like ashes taken from vaults we never opened. The letter was never meant for public reading. It was recovered in 1896 from a private Jesuit archive, its authenticity verified through paleographic analysis. What Cardinal Bertrand alluded to was a fear not of Templar weapons, but of what they had written, mapped, and carried. In the months following the order's suppression, there were reports of unknown figures visiting former Templar sites at night, removing sealed chests and scroll cases before burning what remained. At the Templar preceptory in Leon, witnesses described wagons departing under the guard of knights with no visible insignias, escorted strangely by members of the local clergy. None of these removals were ever recorded officially, but taken together they suggest a final Vatican-sanctioned operation, not to destroy the Templars, but to seize and sterilize the knowledge they left behind, to cleanse the memory without leaving behind a corpse. In the decades after the Templars were disbanded, their name faded from official memory, yet their influence lingered in unexpected places. Not in armies or sermons, but in symbols, architecture, and rituals that began to appear in isolated corners of Europe and beyond. Chapels constructed in the mid-14th century bore odd designs. Circular sanctuaries, inscriptions in obscure Latin dialects, floor mosaics featuring both Christian and Eastern geometric motifs. In Portugal, the newly created Order of Christ, which absorbed many former Templars under royal sanction, quietly maintained rites that mirrored older traditions long thought lost. In Scotland, the Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century, displayed carvings and iconography that scholars still struggle to explain, among them depictions of plants native to the Americas carved decades before Columbus's voyage, and images of twin pillars commonly associated with Eastern mysticism. These echoes are not proof of survival, but they are evidence of memory. Memory preserved outside official channels, nurtured not through defiance, but through discretion. It is in these liminal spaces where ritual meets silence that we see the aftermath of betrayal. What the Vatican could not risk destroying publicly, it buried through redirection. Orders were rebranded. Sacred texts were renamed. Former knights and scribes became masons, scholars, or quiet monastics, still serving but no longer visible. Some historians argue that secret societies that emerged in later centuries, including the Freemasons and Rosicrucians, carried fragments of Templar legacy. These claims are often dismissed as romantic speculation, but the timing is provocative. The earliest confirmed Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland and England in the late 1500s, precisely when the Church was tightening its grip on doctrinal conformity during the Counter-Reformation. Within Masonic ritual, one finds the recurring themes of silence, brotherhood, hidden knowledge, and sacred geometry, all themes that echo the Templar ethos. The assassins, too, left no central remnant, but their approach to secrecy, ideological fidelity, and decentralized communication would later reappear in revolutionary movements across the Islamic world. The institutions died, but their logic survived, and that is what Rome feared most, that betrayal could end an order, but not the ideas it carried. For the Church, the true danger was not the Templars themselves, it was what they left behind in the minds of those still willing to listen. In 1374, nearly 6 decades after the official dissolution of the Templar order, a peculiar letter reached the Vatican from the island of Malta, written by a Dominican friar named Petrus Alverni. The letter described a man who had arrived in Valletta under cover of night. The man wore the tattered remnants of a white mantle and spoke fluent Latin, Arabic, and Occitan. He carried no papers, no coin, only a small scroll case sealed with red wax bearing two impressions, one of the Templar cross and the other a curved blade enclosed in a ring of thorns. The friar claimed that the man spoke only once before disappearing. Tell them memory survived. The Vatican response to this letter, preserved in the Vatican Secret Archive under a nondescript classification, was not to investigate but to confiscate. The letter was marked with the symbol for restricted circulation, and the Dominican who sent it was reassigned to a remote priory in Corsica. No further correspondence from him is recorded. This incident might seem isolated, even apocryphal, were it not for similar reports scattered across the 14th and 15th centuries. Pilgrims traveling through Sicily, southern France, and the coast of Cilicia described run-ins with hooded figures who spoke in riddles, referenced vanished fortresses, and asked cryptic questions about the order beneath the order. These individuals left no trace, never appeared twice in the same region, and always vanished before local clergy could confront them. Some believe they were fabrications, others that they were simply superstitious vagrants. But the Church took them seriously enough to monitor such accounts, recording them not in public annals, but in private ledgers under the control of the Office of the Inquisition. What emerges from these episodes is the outline of a post-suppression resistance, not of violence, but of memory. The Vatican had successfully dismantled the infrastructure of the Templars and erased most documentation of their alliances. But what it could not fully extinguish was the oral transmission of their legacy. Stories, symbols, phrases passed from one monk to another, from one former knight to a hidden apprentice, not enough to rebuild, but more than enough to remember. And sometimes remembrance is more dangerous than rebellion. By the mid-15th century, the Vatican had achieved what many popes had only dreamed of: a centralized structure of spiritual authority reinforced by global expansion, doctrinal uniformity, and an increasingly efficient archive of memory. Yet even within this structured world, strange inconsistencies continued to surface. In 1452, a papal commission was sent to investigate a monastery in Provence after local bishops reported irregular liturgical practices. The visitors found an otherwise obedient community of monks, but noted the presence of an unusual library annex sealed behind an iron gate. Within it were texts bearing no known imprimatur, books with marginalia in Latin, Greek, and what appeared to be Persian. One codex, when opened, fell apart due to age, but a scribe copied a passage before it disintegrated. That passage, now housed in the Vatican archives, read, We were taught by those who stood between the cross and the blade, and what they showed us cannot be unsaid. The monastery was quietly dissolved 2 years later. The monks were reassigned, the site deconsecrated, and the annex sealed. These events were never made public, and no official theological charges were brought. The incident was treated not as heresy, but as contamination. That word, contamination, would appear again in internal Vatican correspondence during the Renaissance, this time in reference to architectural drawings submitted by a papal advisor proposing a new church in Florence. The designs included floor geometry remarkably similar to Templar preceptories and inscriptions that mirrored diagrams once associated with assassin fortresses in Alamut. The advisor was removed from his post, the project was abandoned, and the drawings were sequestered in the Office of Liturgical Censorship. These episodes point to a deep, lingering anxiety within the church hierarchy. Despite the successful suppression of the Templars, their intellectual residue had not been purged. It had diffused into monastic traditions, artisan guilds, esoteric schools, and the architectural blueprints of Renaissance Europe. The betrayal had been effective in dissolving the order, but not in erasing its influence. Rome had controlled the fire, but not the embers. And as the Renaissance dawned with its dangerous curiosity and rediscovery of lost knowledge, those embers threatened to ignite new forms of inquiry the Vatican could neither predict nor contain. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII authorized one of the most sweeping inquisitorial campaigns in church history, culminating in the issuance of the Bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, which legitimized the persecution of supposed heretics, witches, and secret cults across the Holy Roman Empire. While the campaign was publicly framed as a response to rising occultism, buried within its supporting documents were references to the remnants of ancient military orders and philosophies carried east and returned west unguarded. These references were vague enough to escape public scrutiny, but specific enough for those within the Vatican's administrative core to recognize their target. The danger was not witchcraft in the folk sense. It was the resurgence of encoded systems of belief, systems that may have descended from suppressed orders like the Templars or intersected with the mystical branches of Sufism and Eastern Christian Gnosticism. One particularly curious file from this period, held in the restricted Codex Borgia Annex, contains a diagram of interlocking circles labeled keys of transmission. The circles are marked not by names, but by symbols: a cross, a crescent, a key, a flame, and a broken sword. This file contains no date and no author, but it was preserved under the heading Ars Absentium, the art of those who are gone. It was accompanied by a short note, to be watched, not spoken. This phrase would become a quiet directive within the Church's internal policing mechanisms during the Renaissance, appearing again in an undated letter attributed to a member of the Jesuit order. The map of Rome lies not in what is seen, but in what is watched without mention. There are still those who walk with one foot in the old rule and the other in its ashes. The betrayal of the Templars was no longer an active pursuit. It had become an inherited vigilance, passed down through generations of archivists, inquisitors, and confessors trained not only to detect deviation, but to recognize patterns of thought and structure that once belonged to a buried tradition. The Vatican was no longer at war with an order. It was at war with a ghost, one that moved quietly through scholarship, symbol, and silence. In the early 1500s, as printing presses spread across Europe and literacy widened beyond monastic walls, the Vatican faced a new and unprecedented problem. Control over the written word was slipping. Where once a heretical idea could be extinguished with fire and decree, now it could be copied, translated, and smuggled across borders before the ink had dried. Amid this tidal wave of pamphlets and polemics, a few strange tracts began to circulate, unsigned, undated, and written in dense allegory. One such text, later catalogued as the Garden of the Twin Orders, described two brotherhoods born of the same wound, separated by distance but united in silence. The story was couched in symbolic language: a fortress of bone, a mountain of smoke, a chapel without walls. Yet to those familiar with the history of the Templars and the Assassins, the imagery was unmistakable. The Vatican, now navigating the volatile politics of the Reformation, responded not with excommunication, but with redirection. In 1535, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum was formally established, a list of banned books that, while ostensibly aimed at Protestant literature, quietly included titles that hinted at unofficial histories of the Crusades, Jerusalem, and Eastern Brotherhoods. The Church understood something vital. To silence a dangerous idea in the age of print, one must not argue against it, one must drown it in noise. And so the betrayal of the Templars continued, not as persecution, but as dilution. Their memory was either discredited as myth or co-opted into romantic chivalry. The notion of the Templar as a secret bearer of forbidden knowledge was increasingly relegated to fringe texts and speculative fiction. Meanwhile, real questions about their archives, their Eastern alliances, and the full extent of their financial networks were rendered academically irrelevant by design. Only a handful of Vatican historians were permitted access to the sealed Eastern correspondence section of the archives, and even then, only under supervision. What had begun as a political necessity in the 14th century had by the 16th become a cultural erasure strategy, so effective that even those within the Church believed the story had ended. But beneath the illusion of closure, memory endured. in scattered papers, in strange symbols, and in the lingering echo of a question no pope would answer in public. What exactly had been betrayed? By the late 16th century, the remnants of the old orders had become so deeply buried beneath layers of doctrine, politics, and selective memory that few outside the highest circles of ecclesiastical scholarship even knew what had been lost. Yet every so often an anomaly would surface, brief, unexplained, and swiftly contained. One such case occurred in 1583 when a Jesuit scholar named Lorenzo Bellari, stationed in Prague, uncovered a cache of parchments hidden in a sealed compartment beneath the floorboards of St. George's Basilica. The scrolls were fragile and water-damaged, but several bore the unmistakable red cross of the Knights Templar alongside unfamiliar Eastern calligraphy. Bellari, trained in Arabic and Persian, immediately recognized some of the passages as transliterations of Ismaili metaphysical treatises, interwoven with Latin marginal notes speculating on the nature of divine authority, martyrdom, and memory. What shocked him most, however, was the closing line of one scroll. To betray the blade is to forget the silence from which the cross once drew its light. Bellari reported his discovery to the superior general of the Jesuits. Within weeks, he was transferred to a remote outpost in New Spain. His documents were never returned. The basilica underwent sudden renovations the following year, and the floorboards where the scrolls were found were removed entirely. These stories, quiet transfers, redactions, reassignments, formed a pattern too subtle for the public to follow, but unmistakable to those within the Church who had eyes to see it. The betrayal of the Templars had become more than a historical event. It had become a method, a protocol. It was not enough to suppress a dangerous order. One had to anticipate its return in the form of ideas, patterns, or hidden correspondences. The Church began to train a small number of archivists in the identification of symbolic intrusion, rituals, architectural motifs, or coded references that hinted at continuity with the forbidden past. These men, never named publicly, moved quietly through abbeys and libraries across Europe, redrawing the map of memory in real time. They were not inquisitors, nor theologians. They were cartographers of silence. Their task was not to argue against heresy, but to ensure that its language remained undecipherable. In 1609, during a routine reorganization of the Vatican's lesser archives, a junior librarian named Matteo Ricci, not to be confused with the famed Jesuit missionary, came across an unmarked folio wedged behind a set of canonical law volumes. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, but its contents were lucid and alarming. It was not a letter or a theological treatise, but a map, not of land or sea, but of symbols. Circles, crosses, daggers, towers, and veiled stars were arranged in a lattice with annotations in Latin and what appeared to be transliterated Arabic. In the margins, a single phrase recurred in different hands. via silenti custoditur lux. The light is preserved by silence. Ricci brought the map to his supervisor, who immediately confiscated it. The incident was never entered into official record. But months later, a new internal directive was circulated to all archive staff. Any documents bearing symbols inconsistent with church-approved symbology were to be immediately reported and under no circumstances copied. Ricci was quietly removed from his post and reassigned to a monastery in Naples, where he would die in obscurity. This episode, like so many before it, would have been lost had it not been referenced years later in a private journal belonging to a papal aide who worked during the pontificate of Paul V. In his entries, the aide reflected on the growing anxiety among Vatican historians about patterns emerging from the dust, clues and correspondences suggesting that the narrative of Templar dissolution had not, in fact, closed the book. The betrayal had silenced the voices, but not the structure. Someone, or some group, had continued to tend the roots of the forgotten orders, not to revive them in name, but to preserve their message in symbols and stories woven quietly into the margins of Christian memory. What unsettled the Vatican most was not that these messages existed, but that they reappeared in regions with no direct Templar legacy, monasteries in the New World, trading posts in the Levant, even among early Protestant splinter groups. The betrayal had scattered seeds, and centuries later some had begun to sprout in places no one expected. In 1644, a Portuguese nobleman named Dom Sebastián de Alvito petitioned the Holy See for permission to renovate a crumbling chapel on his estate near Tomar, the former spiritual heartland of the Templars in Portugal. What seemed like a benign request took on a stranger dimension when church inspectors arrived to assess the structure. Beneath the altar, laborers uncovered a subterranean chamber lined with faded frescoes. Though damaged by time, the paintings were unmistakably Templar. Knights bearing white mantles with red crosses, flanked by robed figures in Eastern garb. But what stunned the ecclesiastical delegation was a single phrase painted above the archway in deliberate Latin. Truth has two guardians, one that speaks and one that never will. The discovery was deemed irregular, but not heretical, and a quiet order was issued to seal the chamber and resume renovations without further public notice. Dom Sebastián was not punished, but neither was he allowed to pursue his renovations independently again. What mattered to the Vatican was not the theological content of the chamber. It was the implication that the memory of the Templars had endured not in rebellion, but in architecture, passed down within noble families who still held land tied to the old order. This wasn't unique to Portugal. Across Europe, the 17th century saw a rise in private chapels and crypts bearing inscriptions and design elements inconsistent with Counter-Reformation orthodoxy. In Bohemia, a noble family's tomb bore an image of a knight clutching a compass and a stylized olive branch, a combination not found in any known Christian symbology, but curiously similar to Eastern emblems of dual guardianship and measured judgment. These signs were rarely public, but they were consistent. And within the Vatican, scholars working in the Archivum Secretum began quietly compiling a lexicon of residual symbols, motifs thought to be relics of either Templar or assassin design. The betrayal had succeeded in obliterating the political structure of these orders, but it had failed in its deeper aim: total erasure. The memory had gone underground, hidden in chapels, bloodlines, and stone, and it was now surfacing in the very shadows the Church thought it had long since extinguished. In 1671, a Jesuit astronomer stationed in Goa sent a peculiar report to Rome. While charting the stars near a coastal mission, he had been approached by a group of local scholars who presented him with a manuscript they claimed had been gifted to their temple generations prior by foreign knights. The parchment was water-damaged and scorched along its edges, but its contents were legible. The text described a journey across the Indian Ocean, guided not by compass, but by a constellation pattern known to Arab navigators and passed on to warriors of the cross who bore no king. The document included a sketch of a sigil, a double-key symbol intersected by a crescent blade. The Jesuit, confused and curious, sent the manuscript to Rome for analysis. It vanished en route. Weeks later, he received a letter from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. It thanked him for his diligence and instructed him to focus solely on astronomical data going forward. The message was clear: there are some stars the Church does not wish to chart. Back in Rome, these reports were carefully logged but never published. The Vatican had by now refined its method, no longer silencing through fire, but through obscurity. The betrayal of the Templars had transitioned into a subtler form. It was no longer about erasing people. It was about curating what survived, ensuring that any remnants of alternative spiritual lineages were interpreted not as challenges to authority, but as relics of confusion, anomalies best forgotten. The Church had become not a destroyer of memory, but its gatekeeper and its quiet censor. In 1702, during a diplomatic mission to Istanbul, a papal envoy named Cardinal Vincenzo Orsini, who would later become Pope Benedict XIII, recorded a curious meeting in his personal journal. He had been introduced to a scholar at the Sultan's court who claimed descent from a long-dispersed line of Eastern scribes once tied to the Alamut fortress, the legendary stronghold of the Nizari Ismailis. The scholar, well versed in Greek, Arabic, and Latin, shared a manuscript fragment that, according to him, was part of a larger work once held in Alamut's private library before its fall to the Mongols. The text described not theology, but correspondence, letters exchanged between unnamed guardians of the blade and Western keepers of the inner road. Orsini made a copy of the fragment by hand. He later wrote in his journal, "It is not heresy that haunts me, but symmetry. These men on opposite ends of the map speak in mirrors." When Orsini returned to Rome, he deposited the document in a locked drawer beneath his chambers. It was never officially submitted to the Vatican Library. What he had recognized, and what the Vatican increasingly feared, was that the Templars and the assassins may not have merely coexisted. They may have mirrored each other in deliberate design. Both were structured as autonomous cells reporting to a central unseen command. Both emphasized secrecy, initiation, and loyalty to an ideal higher than kings. And both may have viewed themselves not as enemies, but as necessary reflections of the same eternal struggle, discipline and transcendence, control and liberation, each circling the other in a long dance across continents and generations. By the 18th century, the betrayal had acquired a new dimension. It was no longer just a historical act. It had become a philosophical necessity for the Vatican. The Church, in asserting its singular authority over time, memory, and salvation, could not tolerate the idea that two rival orders had once created an independent network of spiritual and political thought, one rooted not in Scripture alone, but in lived practice and silent coordination. The Templars were betrayed not because they failed. They were betrayed because they succeeded too well at becoming something the Church could never allow, a parallel model of order, allegiance, and vision. In 1737, during a theological review of obscure heretical writings in Vienna, a Habsburg archivist stumbled upon a collection of anonymous letters bound in calfskin and tucked behind a shelf of condemned Lutheran texts. These letters, dated inconsistently between 1298 and 1323, bore no author names but were signed with a recurring cipher, two interlocking circles flanked by a vertical line. The content of the letters was cryptic, discussing coded handoffs, sacred texts buried beneath the rule of Peter, and urgent warnings not to trust those who wear the scarlet thread, but speak with a crown's tongue. The archivist, familiar with both Jesuit encryption patterns and early Templar shorthand, sent copies to the Vatican along with a query about provenance. Within 2 months, the Vatican dispatched a team from the Congregation of the Index. The original letters were removed, the archivist quietly retired, and a revised catalog for the collection was issued. The letters were never seen again. This incident was only one in a pattern that grew more frequent in the 18th century. Across Europe, secret collections, mislabeled manuscripts, and unaccounted-for symbols began surfacing in old monasteries, especially those predating the Templar suppression. Even more curiously, many of these locations had no prior connection to the military orders themselves, suggesting that certain forms of knowledge, perhaps passed orally or through loose fraternal bonds, had continued to propagate outside the bounds of official Templar infrastructure. In a monastery outside Krakow, a hidden alcove revealed an altar facing east, decorated with unfamiliar script and a worn mural showing a knight and a veiled figure standing back to back, each holding a broken blade. The Vatican, by this point, had adopted a new stance. Rather than pursue these anomalies as theological threats, it began classifying them as historical curiosities, permitted to exist so long as their interpretation remained under church control. The betrayal of the Templars was no longer enforced through flames or trials, but through narrative. The official story had been written, bound, and shelved. Anything that contradicted it was rebranded as folklore, and the public, trusting in centuries of ecclesiastical authority, rarely questioned the omissions. But truth, once fragmented, has a habit of reassembling in silence. In 1762, a British antiquarian named Charles Stanhope published a limited circulation volume titled The Hidden Rule: Notes on Unacknowledged Orders in Christendom. The work was promptly banned in Catholic regions, but its contents stirred quiet interest among certain academic circles in France, Germany, and the Low Countries. The book made an audacious claim that the Vatican had not merely dissolved the Templars, but had inherited and repurposed portions of their internal structure under different names. Stanhope cited several obscure papal bulls, lesser-known ecclesiastical appointments, and unusual land transfers made in the decades after 1312, many of which lacked conventional legal grounding but involved the same estates once held by the Templars. He also pointed to a line of monastic cells operating along ancient pilgrimage routes that continued to receive secret funding well into the 17th century, long after their original orders had supposedly been extinguished. Stanhope's book included diagrams, charts comparing the organizational structure of the Templars, the Assassins, and several Catholic orders established in their wake. His most provocative hypothesis was that a hidden cadre within the Vatican had studied the operational logic of both the Templars and the Nizaris and preserved their most effective methods, not as homage, but as tools. The betrayal in this telling was not destruction, it was absorption. The Church had taken the structure, stripped it of its autonomy, and buried it beneath the language of obedience. In short, it had turned a rival system into an invisible mechanism of its own expansion. Though derided publicly as fanciful, the hidden rule caused enough discomfort that Vatican officials allegedly inquired about Stanhope's contacts. Within a year, the scholar abandoned his studies and withdrew from public life. His private library was auctioned off after his death, and several of his annotated copies were never recovered. Still, whispers of his work survived, preserved in the margins of later treatises on secret societies and in the teachings of certain esoteric circles across Europe. Stanhope's mistake was not in fabricating a conspiracy. It was in revealing that the real betrayal was not simply suppression. It was theft, of form, of influence, of the right to define history itself. In 1794, during the chaos of the French Revolution, rioters stormed the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. Amid the destruction, a group of revolutionaries broke into the sacristy vaults and discovered a collection of sealed boxes marked with unfamiliar sigils, crosses surrounded by Arabic calligraphy, and geometric keys enclosed in concentric rings. Inside were parchments, coded diagrams, and fragments of ritual texts written in a blend of Latin and Greek, with marginal notes in French and Ottoman Turkish. One document, now lost, reportedly bore the title De Custodia Umbrarum, on the guardianship of shadows. The revolutionaries, unsure of what they had uncovered, handed some of the contents to a radical anti-clerical printing house, but within weeks those pages vanished. The press was raided not by the French military or revolutionary guards, but by agents claiming ecclesiastical authority from outside the new government. They left no names. Only a single note affixed to the door: "Truth misfiled is still truth." This was not the only revolutionary fire to illuminate the shadows. Across Europe, the political upheavals of the late 18th century provided a rare opportunity for long-forgotten documents to resurface. In the burned ruins of a Jesuit college in Belgium, a priest named Henri Marchand uncovered a scroll sealed with red wax and a now extinct Templar sigil. It contained a short theological meditation and a coded set of instructions addressed to a circle of brothers beyond the bond. Marchand sent word to Rome, but by the time a delegation arrived, the scroll had disappeared. The church that housed it was quietly rebuilt, and Marchand was reassigned to a remote parish in Corsica. These fragments suggest that the Vatican's betrayal of the Templars did not end with their erasure. It continued in the form of vigilant recovery, not to preserve the Templars, but to monitor their echoes. The Church had spent centuries developing a silent infrastructure for identifying, collecting, and suppressing stray remnants of the order. It was no longer simply about theological dominance. It was about narrative control. The past had become an archive to be curated, not just of what happened, but of what would be permitted to be remembered. In 1815, as the dust settled over Europe after the fall of Napoleon, delegates at the Congress of Vienna were not the only ones redrawing borders. In the quieter halls of Rome, Vatican officials were undertaking a more delicate task, reassessing the fate of confidential archives that had been displaced, lost, or exposed during the wars. Among the documents recovered was a set of correspondence long thought destroyed, dating from the early 1300s, between unnamed Templar envoys and papal intermediaries. One letter in particular stood out. It contained no request for forgiveness, no plea for reinstatement. Instead, it calmly outlined a set of conditions for silence, terms under which the order would vanish without protest in exchange for the safeguarding of certain repositories of knowledge. The letter did not specify where or what these were, only that their guardianship had already passed beyond the reach of any single institution. At the bottom was a symbol long considered apocryphal, a cross split down the middle, half consumed by flame, half submerged in water. This discovery prompted an internal audit of materials held in what was then still known as the Archivum Secretum. Vatican scholars began noticing a pattern in the so-called non-catalogued items, materials never formally entered into the record, yet maintained with unusual care. Some were fragments, others complete documents, but all bore one common trait. They operated just outside the boundaries of accepted ecclesiastical language. Their theological assertions, historical references, and symbolic systems echoed not the canon of the Church, but that of an order that had not existed officially for over 500 years. Rather than destroy these materials, the Church chose a quieter path. A special subdivision within the archives was formed, charged with the study, containment, and reinterpretation of anomalous texts. Its purpose was not to validate them, but to absorb their language, so that if fragments ever surfaced again in the public realm, they could be explained as misunderstood reflections of orthodoxy rather than dangerous deviations. The betrayal of the Templars had evolved into a long game, not a murder, but a maintenance, not an accusation, but a perpetual preemption. The order was gone, but the Church had never stopped watching for its return, not in form, but in idea. In 1838, a German Orientalist named Friedrich von Riedesel published a controversial monograph titled The Shadow Knights, Eastern Echoes of Western Orders, which sought to trace parallel rituals, codes, and architectural features between the medieval Templars and the Nizari Ismailis. Though academic in tone, the book argued that the two orders had shared not only overlapping objectives, control of pilgrimage routes, development of decentralized command structures, but possibly even direct communication during the Crusades. He based this on a small number of documents preserved in Cairo and Istanbul, which made oblique references to messengers who bore neither banner nor allegiance but spoke the twin prayers. The Vatican issued no official condemnation, but several of the libraries cited in Riedesel's sources reported sudden restrictions on access to their medieval collections soon after the book's release. The author himself, once celebrated in academic circles, was disinvited from a series of lectures in Rome and Paris. A year later, his university withdrew support for a follow-up volume, citing ecclesiastical discomfort. Riedesel never published again. He died in relative obscurity, but his papers, acquired posthumously by a Swiss archive, reveal a deeper concern. In a private letter, he wrote, "They do not fear heresy, they fear memory, and memory, once awakened, does not return quietly to sleep." That fear had by then become institutional policy. The Vatican had moved past simply collecting or sequestering Templar artifacts. It had begun weaving selective elements of their memory into its own systems of control. Rituals were reinterpreted. Sacred geometries that once guided Templar constructions were subtly rebranded as symbolic echoes within papal chapels. Even certain monastic vows, especially those concerning silence, endurance, and obedience to an inner rule, were encouraged so long as they were detached from their historical origins. This was betrayal refined into curation. The Church did not need to suppress what it could repurpose. What emerged from this strategy was not erasure but reassembly under ecclesiastical supervision. The Templars no longer existed, but fragments of their ethos, ritual, and reach were now hidden in plain sight, camouflaged within the very institution that had once condemned them. To the public, the story was over. But to those who knew where to look, it had simply entered its most cunning phase. In 1861, amid the unification of Italy and the political decline of the Papal States, a curious event unfolded within the Vatican's own walls. A young archivist named Matteo Lucari, newly assigned to the Apostolic Library, came across a bundle of undated scrolls misfiled behind a folio on liturgical vestments. These scrolls bore no formal insignia, but were written in a blend of medieval Latin and ciphered French, the sort used by Templar scribes in the late 13th century. One scroll referenced a chamber of the bound silence, a location presumed to be within or beneath a religious stronghold, where the final codex remains sealed by flame and vow. Another spoke cryptically of a second betrayal still pending, one not of blood but of memory. Lucari, fascinated, transcribed excerpts and forwarded them to his superior. He was dismissed within a month. His name does not appear in any subsequent Vatican employment record, and his personal effects were never returned to his family. The timing was not incidental. The Vatican, stripped of its secular territory and increasingly vulnerable to outside scrutiny, had begun quietly re-evaluating what it called its non-canon materials. Texts and artifacts whose origins conflicted with official church history. The fear was not just that outsiders might uncover these materials. It was that the internal consensus about what the church had done and why might begin to fracture. Among the clergy, there were whispers of a ghost archive, a collection of materials so controversial they were not housed within the official Archivum Secretum, but rotated between trusted monastic outposts. These included not only Templar fragments, but letters between obscure bishops and unnamed agents in Syria, financial ledgers bearing markings inconsistent with church accounting systems, and architectural blueprints with annotations in a hybrid of Greek and Arabic. In 1889, during restoration work in the crypt of the Basilica di San Clemente in Rome, masons uncovered a hidden recess behind a brick wall that had not appeared on any architectural plans. Inside lay a weather-worn chest bound in corroded iron bands. The box was quietly turned over to a Dominican priest overseeing the site. Though officially logged as containing liturgical debris, the chest in fact held 4 objects: a rusted dagger etched with a broken cross, a wax-sealed scroll inscribed in Latin and Old Occitan, a faded map fragment with compass markings oriented toward the Levant, and a worn leather-bound volume with no title but a single sigil on its cover, an equilateral triangle flanked by the letters P and R. The priest, trained in church historiography, recognized the dagger's insignia immediately. It was a variation of the Templar emblem that had not been seen since the early 14th century. What followed was not an investigation, but an intervention. Representatives from the Vatican's Congregation for Historical Doctrine arrived within 2 days, removed the items, and reclassified the discovery as non-pertinent. A statement was issued declaring the find to be medieval devotional artifacts of no ecclesiastical relevance. The incident was buried as efficiently as the chest had once been. But the young restoration clerk who had recorded the find, a seminarian named Gianni del Mare, noted in his personal diary that the triangle on the volume matched a mark he had once seen in a Templar ruin outside Carcassonne, on a stone slab thought to have sealed a chamber used for final initiations. Del Mar's diary remained unpublished until the late 20th century, long after his death. The deeper implication was unsettling. Not that relics had survived, but that they had survived beneath the Vatican's own floors. If true, it meant the betrayal had not only extended outward toward France and the Levant, but inward, into the very bones of the Church. The silence was not just administrative. It was architectural, layered into walls, hidden in chapels, waiting beneath centuries of incense and doctrine. It suggested that somewhere, perhaps still, a record of the betrayal remained intact, unread, sealed not by fear of enemies, but by fear of what the truth would demand in return. In 1904, as Pope Pius X launched efforts to modernize the Church's administrative systems and reassert doctrinal clarity, a peculiar letter arrived at the Vatican by way of the Jesuit College in Tarragona, Spain. The letter, unsigned and written in a precise, archaic Latin, contained no greeting, no plea, and no name. It simply opened with a line, "The cross you buried did not rot. It waits in the stones you forgot to bless." Enclosed with the letter was a small vellum fragment bearing a seal long presumed extinct, a variation of the Templar cross entwined with Eastern calligraphy, nearly identical to one found centuries earlier at Saint-Sulpice in Paris. What disturbed Vatican officials was not the message, but the implication. Someone, somewhere, had access to symbolic language, seals, and phrasing believed to have disappeared with the last initiated Templar. The document was forwarded to the Archivum Secretum and categorized under cautionary materials. Behind closed doors, the Curia held briefings on what they termed the continuity hypothesis, the idea that while the Templar hierarchy had dissolved, some encrypted form of its knowledge or allegiance had survived. What followed was a discreet but far-reaching review of ecclesiastical buildings, crypts, and private collections throughout Italy, France, and Spain. They weren't looking for relics, they were looking for patterns. The Vatican had long mastered the tools of preservation. but now it turned them inward, repurposing archivists and scholars into investigators of symbols hidden not by heretics, but by those once trusted within the fold. Secretly, church-appointed architects began inspecting older cathedrals for masonry inconsistent with approved sacred geometry. In Avignon, a cloister's stained glass window was quietly removed after scholars noted its embedded cipher mirrored a sequence found in confiscated Templar texts. In Sicily, a set of sermons by a long-dead bishop were pulled from circulation after marginal notes revealed anagrams tied to ancient initiation rites. By the dawn of the 20th century, the betrayal had become institutional instinct, not merely an act of violence or suppression, but an ingrained reflex, a silent recoil from the possibility that the old order was not gone, only quiet. The Vatican, more than ever, did not fear rebellion. It feared recognition. In 1928, a young Vatican ethnographer named Pietro Carvani was dispatched to Jerusalem to study emerging archaeological findings related to early Christian pilgrimage routes. While examining the foundation stones beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Carvani stumbled upon something unexpected. Inscribed on a dislodged slab in the substructure was a symbol he recognized not from any Christian source, but from a restricted codex back in the Archivum Secretum. It was the divided cross, the mark used in Templar correspondence denoting secret custody or relocation. The slab bore no date, but the style of the carving matched stonework from the late 13th century. More tellingly, it was situated beneath the chapel area that tradition claimed the Templars had once used as a staging post during their time in Jerusalem. Carvani took rubbings of the markings and wrote a detailed report, but when he sent his findings to Rome, he received no response. Upon returning home, he discovered his desk in the Ethnological Museum of the Vatican had been reassigned. When he inquired, he was told his assignment had been terminated and his work redirected. The rubbings were never seen again. Carvani would later describe in a private memoir the strange pressure he felt following the incident, not official sanction, but an unspoken warning that certain questions could not be pursued, even in service of the truth. "It is not the heresies that are most dangerous," he wrote, "but the buried agreements." By the early 20th century, the Vatican's betrayal of the Templars was no longer an active policy. It was a shadow embedded in institutional memory, dictating responses not out of strategy but habit. The original fear that the Templars had formed a network too powerful, too independent, had transformed into an enduring discomfort with ambiguity itself. Anything suggesting that spiritual authority might exist outside Rome's blessing was not confronted directly, but rendered invisible through bureaucracy, reclassification, or silence. Jerusalem was supposed to be the sacred axis around which the Church's legitimacy turned, but Carvani's discovery hinted at a parallel axis, one shaped by those who had once defended the city in the name of a higher, silent rule. And in that silence, the betrayal echoed, not as a scream, but as an unending absence. In 1946, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Vatican launched a confidential initiative to recover ecclesiastical artifacts displaced during the conflict. Entire monasteries had been bombed, archives scattered, and reliquaries looted or hidden for safekeeping. Among the items retrieved by a Vatican envoy in Bavaria was a locked chest stored in the cellar of a partially destroyed abbey near Regensburg. According to the aging abbot who surrendered it, the box had not been opened since the mid-18th century and had been preserved only because it was mistaken for a wine crate during Allied air raids. When Vatican officials opened it in Rome, they found inside a meticulously organized collection of scrolls, wax tablets, and etched brass plates, all bearing cryptic inscriptions in Latin, Old French, and what appeared to be Persian. One scroll ended with a sentence that caused particular concern. Our fire went dark in the west, but it waits east of Rome, where no cross dares cast its shadow. Rather than announcing the discovery or displaying the artifacts, the Vatican catalogued them under a closed classification. A small team of Jesuit historians was granted access under the guise of post-war restoration, but their reports were never published. Instead, several of them were later reassigned to distant missions or cloistered institutions. One, Father Raphael Greco, confided in a fellow scholar before his departure that the documents had included references to a second vault, still hidden beneath the ruins of a known Templar commandery in Provence. According to Greco, it was not gold the Church feared being unearthed, but a ledger of oaths, some of which may have bound men still respected in Vatican lineage to forbidden rituals and forgotten allegiances. By mid-century, the betrayal of the Templars had fully matured into an institutional reflex, not merely a suppression of events, but a suppression of memory itself. The Vatican no longer feared what the Templars had done. It feared what they had remembered. It feared that somewhere, embedded in the forgotten corridors of castles, catacombs, and chapels, were the original terms of an unwritten covenant, one that predated papal supremacy and whispered of a different kind of authority. One not bound by mitres or monarchs, but by silence, fidelity, and a code older than the Church it once served. In 1978, amid the short and mysterious papacy of John Paul I, a reign that lasted only 33 days before his sudden death, an internal Vatican audit was initiated to reassess the Archivum Secretum's sealed holdings. The goal was to modernize cataloging practices and bring coherence to centuries of loosely labeled or uncategorized documents. But what began as a bureaucratic housekeeping effort quickly took on a different tone when one audit team encountered a box marked only with the initials CDL and a wax stamp no longer in use. Inside were not papal bulls or doctrinal decrees, but personal letters exchanged between unnamed ecclesiastics and an elusive network of custodes, guardians, spanning from the early 14th century into the mid-17th. The tone of the letters was not theological, but strategic. They spoke of relocated relics, diverted pilgrimages, and the preservation of the original vow in spirit, if not in name. What disturbed the audit team was not simply the implication of a hidden order, but the explicit reference in one letter to a necessary betrayal for the preservation of the greater body. It was a justification, not for heresy, but for the deliberate sacrifice of the Templars in exchange for the Church's future unity. This correspondence did not frame the betrayal as a mistake, nor as a crime born of politics. It framed it as a calculated mercy. The Templars, according to the letter, had traveled too far into the interior road, risking not rebellion, but a revelation the Church could not afford. The betrayal, then, was not vengeance. It was containment. When John Paul I died less than 5 weeks into his papacy, his death officially ruled natural but shrouded in speculation. The documents from that audit disappeared from circulation. No follow-up audit was conducted. Several members of the team were quietly reassigned to roles outside the archives. And within the halls of Vatican memory, a hush settled back over the question of the Templars. Their history, once marked by swords and flame, had become a question of influence too dangerous to answer. Not because it would destroy the Church, but because it might force it to admit that in protecting its own soul, it had once betrayed a mirror of itself. In 1982, during renovations to a Jesuit college in Avignon, workers uncovered a bricked-over passage beneath the chapel that led to a small crypt chamber not listed on any blueprints. Inside, archaeologists found an altar made of black limestone, a rusted ceremonial sword, and a stone reliquary sealed with a wax mark not seen since the suppression of the Templars in 1312. The mark was authentic, an official ecclesiastical sigil used only by members of the papal curia during the Avignon papacy. Etched into the base of the altar were the words "Et fides perstitit in umbra," and "Faith endured in shadow." No relics were removed publicly. The discovery was reported to Vatican heritage officials, but no records of analysis or removal were ever released. Within a month, the chamber had been resealed. To the public, it had never existed. The site, however, was no random ruin. Avignon had once been the epicenter of papal relocation during the 14th century, the very period in which Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip IV of France, had dissolved the Templars. If any place held physical evidence of what decisions had been made and what silences had been agreed to, it was here. And the chamber beneath the chapel bore more than just the relics of a forgotten brotherhood. Its architecture mirrored that of early Templar sanctuaries, with proportions based on Solomonic geometry and carvings of twin pillars embedded in the surrounding stone. These were not decorative flourishes. They were symbols of a spiritual legacy preserved in stone, out of sight but not out of reach. The Vatican made no public comment, but internally, the find triggered a reevaluation of how much had truly been buried, both physically and ideologically. a quiet directive was circulated among curators and archivists. Re-examine any Templar-related holdings, especially those acquired during the Avignon period, and remove anything lacking traceable provenance. It was a cautious purge, not of people, but of ambiguity. The betrayal, centuries old, still radiated through the walls of church authority, requiring constant maintenance. And as this discovery made clear, history was not so easily buried. Sometimes it waits patiently, sealed behind plaster and stone, beneath layers of incense and ritual, until someone accidentally opens a door. In 1996, a private collector in Portugal announced the discovery of a medieval codex at a rural estate near Tomar, long known as a former stronghold of the Templars. The book, bound in aged goatskin and protected in a cedar chest, contained a series of allegorical meditations written in a hybrid of Latin and Old Portuguese. What caught immediate attention was not the language, but the marginalia. Intricate diagrams, annotations in red ink, and repeated references to the line that remains, a cryptic term seemingly referring to an unbroken spiritual succession. More provocatively, several pages bore notations that matched encrypted phrases found in unpublished fragments of suppressed Templar documents still held in the Vatican's restricted collection. The Vatican issued no official response, but within 6 months the collector rescinded all public statements and claimed the book had been lost in a fire. No independent verification of the manuscript has been allowed since. What the Codex appeared to suggest was that the Templar vow, obedience, secrecy, service to a higher ideal, had not ended with the trials in 1312. Instead, it may have quietly persisted, embedded in symbolic teachings, cloaked orders, and spiritual traditions that never bore the Templar name but carried its structure and vision. These were not military heirs. They were ideological custodians, hidden in plain sight, monks, scholars, architects, cartographers. Their legacy was not visible in cathedrals or flags, but in fragments, maps drawn from memory, prayers with unusual turns of phrase, and the precise symmetry of rural chapels aligned with ancient stars. To the Vatican, such survivals were intolerable, not because they posed physical danger, but because they suggested continuity without permission, a chain of spiritual memory that had escaped papal erasure. And in the 20th century, with modern historical scrutiny growing ever sharper, the Vatican's role in the Templar suppression came under renewed academic interest. The official line remained unchanged. The order had grown corrupt, had been judged fairly, and its dissolution was a matter of justice. But off the record, in quieter circles, a different tone was emerging. Not denial, not even regret, but something closer to unease, as if the betrayal, once a moment of power, had matured into a question with no stable answer, echoing louder the longer it was left unanswered. In 2007, a development occurred that quietly shook the foundations of how the Vatican had managed the Templar legacy for centuries. The Vatican's secret archives, under increasing pressure from modern historians and transparency advocates, released a facsimile edition of a document known as the Chinon parchment. Originally discovered in 2001 but kept largely out of public discourse, the parchment was a record of a papal inquiry conducted in 1308. It documented how Pope Clement V, through his appointed cardinals, had actually absolved the Templar leadership of heresy, specifically Jacques de Molay and several others, after private interrogations at the Château de Chinon. They confessed to certain irregularities under pressure, but were granted absolution and returned to communion with the Church. The document, signed and sealed, had been quietly stored and forgotten for over 600 years. Publicly, the Vatican framed the parchment's release as a gesture of openness, but the context was more complicated. The document had been rediscovered years earlier by archivist Barbara Frail, and only after intense academic and internal scrutiny was it deemed suitable for publication. Even then, the release came without commentary on why the absolution had been ignored in subsequent papal actions, or why the Templars were still burned, disbanded, and publicly defamed. The betrayal, it seemed, had always been known. The Church had simply chosen silence over contradiction. To historians and Templar researchers, the Chinon parchment was a long-lost key. But to the Vatican, it was a liability that could no longer be hidden. It did not rewrite the betrayal. It confirmed it, not as rumor or legend, but as an archival fact. The Church had condemned what it had already forgiven, and in that contradiction lay the quiet heart of one of history's most enduring silences. In 2013, as Pope Benedict XVI stunned the world by announcing his resignation, the first in nearly 6 centuries, some Vatican watchers turned their attention to the unusual conditions surrounding his departure. While most speculation focused on church politics, internal scandals, and personal health, a few insiders whispered about a lesser-known issue that had surfaced during Benedict's pontificate: a renewed internal review of the Church's historical relationship to secret orders, particularly the Templars. That review, according to several unnamed archivists and scholars, had unearthed more than just records. It had reactivated old questions, ones the Church had worked hard to keep dormant. Among the materials re-examined was a series of correspondences from the early 14th century, reportedly stored in a sealed drawer within the Vatican Library's most restricted wing. These letters contained not only reports on the Templars' financial networks, but also records of secret negotiations between Church officials and surviving members of the order after its supposed dissolution. The content implied that not all Templars were rounded up or executed. Some had entered into quiet agreements with Church authorities, surrendering assets in exchange for safe passage or clerical reassignment. One name repeatedly surfaced: Frater A.H., a figure believed to have served as a liaison between Templar survivors and sympathetic bishops in northern Italy and Dalmatia. Benedict's resignation was never officially linked to these rediscovered records, but some close to the process have suggested that the resurfacing of such evidence complicated ongoing discussions about church transparency and historical accountability. In private circles, questions were raised. Could the Church ever acknowledge not only the unjust suppression of the Templars, but the quiet deals that followed? Could it risk revealing the full extent of what it had done, not just in 1312, but in the centuries that followed, in silence? The betrayal was no longer just historical. It had become structural, embedded in the institutional DNA of the Vatican. And as modernity crept closer, with archives digitizing, scholars networking, and stories resurfacing, the danger wasn't merely what the Church had hidden, it was what might still be hiding inside the Church itself. Echoes of an oath, a memory unburied, a legacy that never needed papal permission to endure. In 2017, during a symposium on medieval ecclesiastical politics held in Turin, a Jesuit historian named Father Lucien Navarro presented a paper that drew surprisingly little attention outside the academic world. His topic was the linguistic evolution of ecclesiastical Latin during the 13th and 14th centuries. But embedded within his presentation was a provocative thesis. Certain recurring phrases in papal correspondence from the early 1300s, especially those relating to heresy, unity, and obedience, shared unusual syntactic structures with the internal dispatches of suppressed military orders. Navarro hinted, without overtly naming the Templars, that this convergence was likely not coincidental. It suggested that the language of church authority had been subtly informed by the very group it had condemned. What made Navarro's findings more than academic curiosity was the implication that Templar ideology had not simply been suppressed, it had been absorbed. Ideas about decentralized governance, silent vows, and sacred geometry had quietly seeped into the administrative habits and theological rhetoric of the post-Templar Church. Navarro's sources included private letters between bishops, obscure theological treatises, and marginalia scrawled in medieval breviaries that had never been formally catalogued. Several audience members, recognizing the broader implications, pressed him in the Q&A, asking whether he believed the Church had knowingly integrated aspects of Templar practice. Navarro declined to answer directly, saying only, "If you eat from the same tree, your breath will carry the same fruit." Following the symposium, Navarro's paper was quietly pulled from the official proceedings and never published. He later accepted a research position in South America, far from the Vatican's academic centers. His departure was never explained, but colleagues noted that several of his materials, especially facsimiles of 14th century Vatican letters, were no longer available in his former office. The Church issued no statement, but within certain Jesuit circles, Navarro's work became the subject of private study. In 2019, a controversial independent documentary titled The 13th Silence premiered at a small European film festival. Produced by a group of French and Italian historians, it focused on inconsistencies in the Vatican's official record regarding the suppression of the Knights Templar. The film leaned heavily on newly digitized documents from regional archives, letters, receipts, land records, and ecclesiastical reports from the years 1307 to 1320. Some of these materials suggested that several Templar estates were not confiscated by the crown or the church, as was widely believed, but transferred discreetly to private monastic orders with direct ties to Rome. These transactions were masked through third-party intermediaries, often accompanied by cryptic marginalia in Latin, referring to the silent brotherhood and the keeping of the fourth vow. The betrayal, long treated as an event locked in the 14th century, had now returned in modern form, not as a massacre or suppression, but as a quiet war over narrative. And the Vatican's response was telling. It did not issue denials or condemnations. It simply erased the noise, as it had done so many times before. But this time, the silence felt different. It no longer concealed something long gone. It hinted that something old might still be alive. In 2021, a team of researchers affiliated with an academic project on medieval religious iconography published a paper analyzing previously overlooked carvings inside the Basilica of San Miniato al Monte in Florence. One of the motifs, hidden beneath centuries of whitewash, depicted two riders on a single horse, an unmistakable Templar symbol. But the carving also featured a crescent moon positioned between their heads and a key embedded in the tail of the horse. The accompanying inscription, nearly eroded, translated loosely to, "Not all that fled was lost. Some were called back in silence." The artwork was dated to the early 14th century, shortly after the Templar trials had begun. This placed its creation after the public suppression of the order, raising a fundamental question: who had carved it, and why was it preserved within a basilica so close to Vatican authority? The find triggered immediate interest in art history circles, but little acknowledgement from church officials. Yet within weeks, the frescoed panel was recovered during a routine restoration effort, and access to the substructure was limited to approved personnel only. An Italian journalist who attempted to document the artwork was denied entry and later published a censored version of the image online. The Vatican issued no public statement, but several scholars noted the familiar pattern: discovery, limited exposure, removal, and then silence. This particular image, however, struck a deeper nerve. It was not only symbolic of Templar memory, it seemed to imply complicity, that some members of the church had known what was being done to the Templars, had disagreed, and had left clues in the sacred architecture for future generations to find. The betrayal, then, was not unanimous. It was negotiated. Some priests condemned, others protected. Some erased, others carved. And through these quiet, stubborn inscriptions, the story persisted, not through battle or books, but through stone. By the third decade of the 21st century, the Vatican had long since abandoned its campaign of overt suppression, but a quieter vigilance remained, one that did not fear scandal, but implication. For if the betrayal had been an error, it could be acknowledged. But if it had been a strategy, one knowingly carried through and symbolically mourned even as it was enacted, then the silence was not defensive. It was part of the design. In 2022, a quiet stir passed through the Vatican's archival community after the rediscovery of a long-forgotten letter buried within a folio labeled De Ordine et Disciplina. The letter, dated March 1313, 1 year after the official dissolution of the Templars, was addressed from a cardinal of the Curia in Avignon to an unnamed cleric in Toledo. Written in a tightly looped Latin hand, it spoke in veiled but unmistakable terms. Though the order is extinguished by flame, the line of flame continues beneath the ash. Mark the ones who did not kneel, for they are bound still to the fourth promise. No additional context was provided. The phrase fourth promise had no recognized place in church liturgy or known Templar rites, and yet it echoed a recurring motif found in scattered Templar inscriptions and monastic codices, the notion of an unwritten vow, one higher than obedience to pope or king. The implications were staggering. If a fourth promise existed, it suggested that the Templar Brotherhood had operated not only with internal cohesion, but with an esoteric hierarchy above even papal control. A vow made not to Rome, but to a principle that the Church could neither define nor extinguish. The letter made no mention of heresy or deviation, only preservation. Its tone was not defiant, but reverent, as if acknowledging that something sacred had been lost, but not entirely. The writer urged the recipient to continue the work under the veil of brotherhood, and signed only with a symbol, a trisected circle long associated with Templar architectural planning. The Vatican, according to internal sources, acknowledged the letter's existence, but reclassified it almost immediately under restricted status. Outside scholars were not permitted to view the original. The official explanations cited misfiled private correspondence of non-doctrinal relevance, but those familiar with the archive's indexing system knew better. Misfilings do not remain hidden for 700 years without intention. This wasn't just another trace of Templar survival. It was a confession, written not by a renegade knight but by a church official, admitting in code that something had endured, something unsanctioned, something sanctified by silence. If the betrayal had been meant to end a chapter, this letter proved it had only turned the page, and someone within the church had known it all along. In 2023, a small but striking revelation emerged from an unlikely source. A doctoral thesis at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. The thesis focused on symbolic continuity in post-Crusade ecclesiastical architecture, analyzed chapel layouts and iconographic details from 1300 to 1500. The author, a young ecclesiastical historian named Clara Bellini, noticed a recurring anomaly in floor plans of chapels built in the decades following the Templar suppression. In dozens of churches across Italy, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, the stonework beneath or around the altar subtly incorporated a geometric form that didn't belong to conventional Catholic tradition, a variation of the vesica piscis, a symbol often associated with sacred knowledge and divine union, but rendered here in a peculiar angular style, reminiscent of Templar schematics found in pre-suppression blueprints. Bellini's work, though formally academic, was more than architectural theory. She proposed that this design signature functioned as a kind of hidden memorial, a silent watermark left by masons or clerics with personal or spiritual ties to the fallen order. The symbolism was never overt, but it was consistent. Even in places far removed from former Templar strongholds, chapels built under papal commission subtly echoed a design language thought to have been extinguished. Bellini traced funding documents that revealed that some of these chapels were financed by families known to have protected Templar assets during the dissolution. What her thesis exposed, without outright claiming it, was the possibility that elements within the Church had knowingly preserved a visual tribute to the Templars beneath the floorboards of orthodoxy. The betrayal, it seemed, had not been total. Like the saints whose relics were sealed inside altars, the memory of the order had been interred, safely, reverently, just beneath the surface. A priest reading from the pulpit might never know. A cardinal walking the nave might never sense it, but it was there. Quiet geometry, silent continuity, a mark of reverence disguised as routine. Bellini graduated, but her work was never widely circulated. The printed thesis remained in university archives. When asked in an interview if she believed the Church had betrayed the Templars, she smiled and said, "That depends on which part of the Church you mean." In 2024, as part of a Vatican-sponsored initiative to digitize rare documents and increase scholarly access, a short-lived web portal briefly made public several 14th-century manuscripts previously limited to restricted ecclesiastical researchers. Among these was a translation guide compiled by an unnamed scribe during the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312, the very council at which Pope Clement V formally disbanded the Knights Templar. At first glance, the document appeared to be a mundane glossary for legal and theological Latin. But within its margins were curious annotations, strange symbols, cross-referenced words, and ciphered notes in a hybrid of Occitan and Greek. The symbols mirrored those found in earlier Templar codices seized by papal agents during the arrests. One recurring mark, a cross flanked by two circles, was associated with Templar record-keeping protocols and had not appeared in any official church documentation after 1312. The portal, launched with fanfare and presented as part of the church's growing transparency initiative, went offline less than 48 hours after this manuscript was noticed by several independent medievalists. No explanation was offered. Those who had downloaded the document quickly found that citations to its archival location now returned errors. The Vatican stated that certain files had been prematurely uploaded. But among the academic community there was little doubt. The manuscript's annotations hinted at something too delicate to leave in public view. That elements of the Templar information infrastructure, its languages, its encryption habits, even its theological distinctions, had not only survived but were being quietly referenced during the very council that condemned them. What emerged from this episode was not new proof of conspiracy, but evidence of proximity. The betrayal, it seemed, had not come from a distant seat of judgment, but from across the very tables where decisions were drafted. Those who outlawed the Templars had also studied their methods. Those who silenced them had borrowed their systems. And in this glossary, buried in the mundane lexicon of church governance, the two languages, Rome's and the Templars, briefly overlapped like twin shadows cast by the same fading flame. By now, the betrayal was more than a question of morality or justice. It had become a mirror, one that refused to stop reflecting. In 2025, a quiet leak from inside the Vatican's Apostolic Library reached the inbox of a retired historian living in Ghent. The file, sent anonymously, was a scanned image of a parchment titled Libellus de Sanguine Tradito, the Book of the Blood Delivered, dated to the mid-14th century and marked with the seal of a now-defunct curial sub-office. The document was neither doctrinal nor liturgical. It was, instead, a report. It detailed a secret investigation launched decades after the Templar suppression, focused not on theology, but on inheritance. Specifically, the transmission of knowledge, ritual, and lineage from Templar fugitives to certain families within the Italian peninsula and southern France. The document referenced bloodlines, coded genealogies, and an unbroken right held in the custody of stone and memory. More disturbingly, it included a list of names and places, many of which correlated with known noble houses who later funded papal campaigns or monastic expansions. The historian, stunned by the implications, verified the metadata and handwriting style with peers, all of whom confirmed its authenticity. The text referenced fragments of the original rule that cannot be uttered, suggesting that what survived was not simply history but liturgy, ritual acts performed in secret for generations. These rites, according to the document, had never fully ceased. They had migrated into rural chapels, family vaults, and obscure monastic retreats. The Church had known. Not only had it known, it had documented the survival. not to preserve it, but to monitor its spread. The betrayal, long thought to be an extinguishing act, was now seen as a pruning. Rome had cut the visible limbs of the order, but had allowed, or perhaps engineered, the growth of its roots into the darker soil of Catholic power, not to eliminate the Templar ethos, but to reframe it, to redirect its energy toward Rome's own architecture of control. What was once a sacred brotherhood had become a ghost structure, moving beneath titles, beneath bloodlines, beneath stone. And now, centuries later, the parchment whispered of that subterranean continuity, a spiritual echo carried through names, habits, and unspoken rites. The Vatican may have betrayed the Templars to the world, but privately it had followed their path into silence. In early 2025, a professor at the University of Salamanca uncovered a hidden compartment within a 15th century folio believed to be a devotional manual for traveling clergy. The compartment, sealed behind a false binding, contained a bundle of smaller leaves wrapped in waxed linen. What lay within was not prayer or doctrine, but a careful log of coded correspondences, written in early Castilian with traces of Provençal, detailing a network of silent affiliates tied to the remnants of the Templar commanderies. Each letter bore no name, only symbols and numbers that matched records from confiscated Templar estates in Spain, Portugal, and Languedoc. The tone of the letters was quiet, observational. They tracked movements, deaths, inheritances, even marriages made for the purpose of hiding sacred objects or preserving ritual knowledge across generations. The documents, dubbed Las Cartas del Voto, the letters of the vow, did not describe rebellion. They chronicled persistence. One line repeated across multiple entries read, "The mantle is gone, but the vow is kept." It became clear that what had survived the Vatican's suppression was not a military order, but a philosophy. One passed like a whisper through old families, esoteric brotherhoods, and stonework that spoke in silence. Even more intriguing was the occasional reference to sympathetic clerics, men ordained under Rome but loyal to a deeper, older oath. When news of the discovery began to circulate within academic circles, the university received a formal request from Vatican liaisons asking for digital access to the documents for the sake of curatorial authentication. Days later, the professor's office was reportedly broken into, and 2 of the letters, keyed to a code book believed to be lost, were taken. No arrests were made. The surviving materials were secured in a private archive outside church jurisdiction. But the message was clear. The Vatican was still watching. This wasn't about power anymore. It was about memory. The betrayal of the Templars had created not an end, but a subterranean pulse, one that moved through crypts, codices, and stone altars without ever rising fully to the surface. And the Church, even now, seemed less afraid of ghosts than of recognition. Not of what it had done, but of how much it still resembled what it tried to destroy. In mid-2025, a Benedictine monk serving as an archivist in the Swiss Alps, quietly released an anonymous essay under the pseudonym FSC. The essay, titled Echoes in the Vault, appeared for just 48 hours on an obscure theological forum before it was removed. In it, the monk described the discovery of an iron-bound chest buried beneath the foundation stones of a ruined monastic outpost abandoned since the 15th century. The chest contained no relics or gold, only parchment fragments, worn smooth from time and damp. These were not theological treatises, but reflections, personal accounts, meditative notes, and a record of silent meetings held by men who identified themselves not by rank, but by vow. They never used the word Templar, but the symbols matched: the bisected circle, the twin rider, the triple-pointed cross. One fragment recounted a meeting in the year 1371 in which 5 men, each described by trade rather than title, spoke of a path no longer blessed by Rome, but still aligned with the Christ of silence. The tone was gentle, sorrowful. There was no hatred toward the Church, only mourning for a brotherhood sacrificed to ensure the walls remained standing. Another described a ritual reenacted yearly beneath the open vault of stars, invoking protection not for their order, but for those still watching from within the very institutions that had condemned them. The final note, smeared by water damage, simply read, "To speak now would be to sever the thread. Let the betrayal remain the veil." In late 2025, as part of an international exhibition on medieval secrecy hosted at the British Library, a little-known Templar codex was placed on public display for the first time. Catalogued as Manuscript 639A, it had sat for decades in storage, deemed too damaged and obscure to warrant serious attention. But new ultraviolet imaging revealed palimpsests beneath the visible text, uncovering layers of writing deliberately scraped away. The erased content included names, diagrams, and, most unsettling, references to a council held not in Vienne or Rome, but in a remote mountain chapel, years after the order had been officially dissolved. This shadow council, as it was euphemistically called, was convened by surviving Templar brothers under the silent protection of unnamed clerics. Their goal, as recorded in fragmented Latin, was not vengeance, but memory. "We do not return to strike," one line read, "but to remember that we were not erased." The exhibit drew scholars from across Europe, and while most focused on the codex's layered artistry, a small group of researchers quietly began cross-referencing the hidden passages with obscure monastic correspondence from the early 15th century. What emerged was a sobering realization. The Vatican had likely known about this shadow council for centuries. Corresponding notations in the Vatican Library Index showed unexplained gaps in the folios from that same region and period, the timing aligned too closely to dismiss as coincidence. The betrayal had begun as a political necessity, an alliance between church and monarchy to remove a rival power. But what had lingered across time was not the act, but the justification. The Templars had been declared heretics not because they were corrupt, but because they were inconvenient. Their independence, their wealth, and their loyalty to something beyond the papacy had made them dangerous. And in order to maintain control, the Vatican had turned against its own knights, publicly condemning them, privately absorbing them, and eventually forgetting them with purpose. But documents have a way of surviving, and the past, however quietly, has a pulse. Now, in the light of scholarship and silence alike, it was becoming harder for the Vatican to deny the shape of its own shadow. One final chapter remains. In 2025, in a final act of quiet defiance or perhaps reconciliation, a retired Vatican librarian nearing the end of his life released a sealed envelope to a consortium of historians in Lyon. The envelope contained a handwritten letter and a single copied page from what he claimed was a suppressed register deep within the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. The register, titled Acta contra fratres absconditos, Actions Against the Hidden Brothers, contained not accusations but ongoing notations that stretched across centuries. The copied page dated to 1789, just before the French Revolution, and described the reappearance of a brotherhood bearing signs of the ancient rite, but speaking in parables and traveling without names. The notation concluded with a chilling recommendation: do not pursue, observe. They belong to the silence we authored. This was no longer just about the 14th century betrayal. The document made clear that the Vatican had continued to monitor Templar echoes into the modern era, not to confront them, but to ensure they remained disarmed, scattered, and voiceless. It wasn't fear of resurrection that drove this watchfulness. It was the fear that recognition might unravel the narrative the Church had woven since 1312. The Templars' destruction had not simply been an act of power. It had become doctrine, and undoing it, even now, would mean admitting that faith could be manipulated for control. The librarian, in his final words, did not accuse. He simply wrote, "Forgive me. I helped to keep the doors closed, but I believe now that truth, however painful, serves God better than silence ever could." His confession, barely noticed by the world, was passed from scholar to scholar, some of whom had spent their entire careers following threads through forgotten archives and fractured manuscripts. The betrayal of the Templars was no longer just a historical event. It had become an ethical wound, still unhealed. A centuries-long silence, maintained not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that to acknowledge the full truth would be to admit that even the holiest institutions can betray the very ideals they were meant to protect. And so we end where we began, not with flame and sword, but with memory and silence. Because in the end, the question is not only whether the Vatican betrayed the Templars, it is whether it ever stopped.